Hey everybody, Andy Cavernan here with another Cornerstone Connection Daily Devotional. From time to time I run into people who are experiencing varying states of brokenness. They're going through difficult things, and sometimes the brokenness is a result of things that have happened to them, things that they didn't invite, they didn't cause. Whether it's the loss of a job or an illness or the loss of a loved one. Maybe it's a relational struggle that they've been working hard to work through, and yet they just can't seem to make any traction. So there are those kinds of things that people experience, but sometimes their state of brokenness is a result of their own sin. In fact, I've been confronted with that too, being broken over my sin. And the reality is that God means to confront our sin so that we experience brokenness, so that we experience godly sorrow that leads to repentance, that leads to salvation, as Paul talks about to the Corinthian church. God longs for us to experience His salvation, but that often begins with brokenness. And with that in mind, I read a book this morning, the book of Joel in the Old Testament. It's a short book, only 3 chapters. And in that, God is confronting Israel yet again with their sin, and He's calling them to brokenness. I want you to hear what He says in Joel chapter 2, verse 10 and following. He says, "The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon are darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining. The Lord utters His voice before His army. For His camp is exceedingly great. He who executes His word is powerful. For the day of the Lord is great and very awesome. Who can endure it?" When the day of the Lord comes, He's bringing judgment on the people. And Joel is recognizing this and preparing the people for the day of the Lord, which will be terrible, which will be awesome. Who can endure it? But then he says this, verse 12, "Yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning, and rend your hearts and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for He is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and He relents over disaster." I love the truths represented in those verses, that the Lord desires us not to rend our garments, which is a public display of repentance. That's fine and good, but it means nothing unless our hearts are rent. The word rend means tear. Our hearts are broken, are torn before the Lord. Joel says, "Rend your hearts and not your garments. Return to the Lord." Why? Well, because He's gracious and He's merciful. God delights in expressing His grace and His mercy to those who are repentant, who come to Him. He's slow to anger, and He's abounding in steadfast, hesed love, loyal, faithful love. And it says this, I love this line, "and He relents over disaster." God is a God who relents. He relents over disaster, and we can trust Him. Now, I love what He finishes with in verse 25. Actually, He doesn't finish, but I love what He goes to. And sometimes when we think of our brokenness, our sin, and the different challenges that we're facing, we can get pretty bent out of shape, and that's understandable. And we can wonder, is there any hope for me? Look what God says through Joel to the people of Israel, verse 25. He says, "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten." And the locust was a sign of judgment for the people, but God says, "I'm going to give you those years back." That's the kind of God that I am. I'm going to do that for Israel. And friends, if we know that God will do that for Israel, we can be confident that He'll do that for us too. As we rend our hearts and not our garments, we can experience God's loyal, hesed, gracious mercy. And we can come back to God with the confidence that He delights in us and longs for us to be with Him. The Lord is the God who promises to restore the years that the swarming locust has eaten. He'll do that for you if you trust Him. God bless.